settle into the Sleepy Mind channel. Tonight, we will journey through the remarkable history of London Bridge and discover how one of London's most famous crossings eventually found a new home beneath the Arizona sun. There are certain songs that seem to settle into our memories so early that it becomes almost impossible to remember when we first learn them. They are simply there, tucked away among the sounds and images of childhood, waiting for a familiar melody to bring them back. One of those songs begins with a bridge. London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. Perhaps you remember those words from childhood, long before London was anything more than the name of a distant city. For generations, children sang them in classrooms, schoolyards, gardens, and playgrounds, often while playing a game in which two children raised their arms to form a bridge while the others passed underneath. At just the right moment, the arms came down, the bridge fell, and someone was caught beneath it. Then the game began again. It was simple enough that there seemed to be no reason to wonder about it. London Bridge fell down because that was what London Bridge did in the song. Then it was built again, only for another material to prove unsuitable. Wood and clay might wash away. Other versions suggested bricks and mortar, iron and steel, silver and gold. The details changed between places and generations, but the bridge remained at the center of the rhyme, repeatedly falling and repeatedly being rebuilt. What most children singing those words could not have known was that the real London Bridge had experienced something remarkably similar across its extraordinarily long history. There has never been just one London Bridge. Bridges have stood at or close to the same crossing of the River Thames for nearly 2,000 years, and one structure after another has been built, damaged, repaired, replaced, or removed. Some were made largely of timber. One famous medieval bridge was built from stone and survived for more than 6 centuries. Another opened in the 19th century and eventually became the bridge whose story will carry us all the way from England to Arizona. That last part would have sounded almost impossible to the generations who knew London Bridge only as a landmark of the English capital. Yet thousands of pieces of granite that once formed the exterior of a London bridge really did leave England. They crossed the Atlantic, traveled through the Panama Canal, reached California, and continued by road into the Arizona desert. There they were assembled around a new structure beside Lake Havasu, where London Bridge stands today beneath a landscape of blue water, desert mountains, palms, and brilliant sunshine. The journey to Arizona, however, belongs much later in our story. Long before anyone imagined selling a bridge, and long before Arizona was even part of the United States, London Bridge already had a history filled with fires, floods, rebuilding, crowded houses, merchants, kings, battles, and centuries of people crossing the Thames. Even the bridge purchased by an American businessman in the 20th century was only one member of a very old family of bridges carrying the same name. If you're listening to this as you drift towards sleep, I'm really glad you're here with me. If you enjoy these journeys, please like the video and subscribe to the Sleepy Mind channel. It truly helps me keep creating new sleepy stories like these every other day. For all night listening, check out the playlists on a variety of interesting topics like nature, space, the human body, history, and more, all ready to carry you through the night. The familiar rhyme, "London Bridge is falling down," is part of an old tradition whose beginnings are surprisingly difficult to pin down. Like many nursery rhymes, It existed in spoken and sung forms before anyone made the sort of careful records that would allow historians to identify a single author or an exact date of composition. Songs learned in childhood could pass from one generation to another without ever being formally published. A parent could teach a child. Older children could teach younger ones. A version sung in one village could be slightly different from one sung somewhere else, and over decades or centuries, the words could continue changing while the central idea remained recognizable. That makes London Bridge is Falling Down less like a modern song, with a known composer and publication date, and more like a piece of cultural memory. Its survival depended upon people remembering it. The melody helped. So did repetition. Most importantly, the rhyme could become a game, allowing children to act out the falling bridge rather than merely sing about it. In the best-known form of the game, two children face one another and raise their arms to create an arch. The others pass underneath while the rhyme is sung. When the appropriate moment arrives, the raised arms drop and trap whichever player happens to be beneath them. The structure of the game is so straightforward that it could be repeated almost anywhere. Nothing more elaborate than a group of children was required. The bridge could appear in a schoolyard thousands of miles from London without a single stone, plank, or drop of river water. By the 19th and 20th centuries, versions of the rhyme and game were familiar well beyond Britain. Children across the English-speaking world could know London Bridge without ever seeing London. The name became recognizable before many children understood that it referred to a real crossing over a real river. For someone growing up in America, London Bridge might first have existed as a melody rather than a place. There is something especially curious about that today, because one of the real bridges to carry the name eventually became American as well. A child in Arizona could sing London Bridge is Falling Down while living in the same state where pieces of an actual former London bridge would eventually stand. The rhyme and the physical bridge followed completely different paths across history, yet both somehow traveled far beyond the Thames. It is important, however, not to combine those two histories too neatly. The bridge now standing at Lake Havasu is not the bridge that originally inspired the nursery rhyme, at least not in any simple sense. The structure, whose granite exterior was transported to Arizona, did not open until the year 1831. The rhyme and the traditions surrounding it are older. By the time that 19th century bridge appeared, Londoners had already been crossing the Thames at London Bridge for many centuries. This distinction becomes easy to lose because the name remains the same. If a building is replaced, the new structure usually receives a new identity. London Bridge is different. One bridge disappeared and another inherited its name. That replacement could eventually disappear as well, while yet another London Bridge continued the story. The result is a chain of structures extending backward through time. The 19th century bridge that eventually reached Arizona therefore belongs to the same historical crossing as the earlier bridges without actually being those bridges. Its stones did not witness medieval London. They did not carry knights across the Thames or support houses and shops above the river. Those scenes belong to an older London bridge. But the bridge that went to Arizona inherited the name, the location, and the accumulated reputation of everything that had stood there before it. The nursery rhyme adds another layer, because nobody can say with certainty exactly what event, if any, first inspired its central image. Historians and folklorists have proposed several explanations. Some are based on specific moments in London's history. Others suggest that the rhyme may simply reflect a recurring reality familiar to earlier generations. Bridges were difficult to keep standing. A bridge is easy to take for granted when it is made from modern steel and concrete and inspected by engineers using technologies unavailable to earlier builders. For much of history, a major river crossing was a far more vulnerable thing. Timber decayed, foundations shifted, floodwater pushed against supports, floating debris struck piers, fire could spread through wooden structures, ice could create additional pressure, heavy use gradually wore materials down. Warfare could turn a bridge into a target. So the repeated idea of building London Bridge only to discover that the chosen material would fail may have seemed perfectly natural to people who lived in a world where bridges really did require constant maintenance and replacement. The rhyme did not necessarily need one spectacular disaster to make sense. The struggle to keep a crossing open could itself provide all the inspiration required. Still, one particular story has fascinated people because it sounds almost uncannily like the song. It takes us back more than 1,000 years to an age when Scandinavian armies, English kings, fortified towns, and wooden ships shaped events around the Thames. Around the year 1014, England was caught in political and military struggles involving King Ethelred and Scandinavian forces. Later, Norse tradition tells of the Norwegian warrior Olaf Haraldsson taking part in an attack against a bridge at London. Olaf would eventually become King of Norway, and after his death, he would be remembered as Saint Olaf. According to the dramatic account, defenders occupied the bridge while Olaf and his men approached from the river in ships. The men protected their vessels from objects thrown down from above, moved beneath the crossing, attached ropes to the bridge's supports, and pulled. The structure gave way, sending defenders down with it. The resemblance to a bridge falling into the river is irresistible. It has led to suggestions that some distant memory of this event eventually became London Bridge's falling down. The possibility is often repeated because it provides such a satisfying origin story. An ancient battle, a collapsing bridge, and a children's song carrying a fragment of the event across 1,000 years. But satisfying stories are not always provable ones. The Norse account was recorded after the events it describes, and historians debate aspects of the story. More importantly, there is no continuous trail of evidence connecting that episode directly to the later nursery rhyme. Centuries separate the supposed attack from the versions of the rhyme that can be documented with confidence. The Viking connection therefore remains a theory rather than an established fact. It may be true that an ancient bridge was attacked and damaged during struggles for London. It does not follow automatically that children singing "London Bridge is Falling Down" centuries later were unknowingly describing that particular event. Other explanations have been offered. Some connect the rhyme with the repeated rebuilding of London Bridge over the centuries. Others have looked for meanings in the different materials mentioned in its verses. Folklore has even produced darker interpretations involving old beliefs about protecting buildings or bridges, although these stories provide no secure explanation for the London rhyme itself. The uncertainty may actually suit London Bridge rather well. There are so many layers of history at this crossing that trying to attach the song to one moment almost makes the story smaller. Bridges here really did come and go. They really were repaired and rebuilt. Fire really was a danger. Floods really could cause damage. Political struggles really did involve the crossing. London Bridge did not need to fall only once to become associated with rebuilding. And all of these stories take us far deeper into the past than the bridge now standing in Arizona. To find the beginning of the physical story, we have to strip away almost everything we recognize about London. The great dome of St. Paul's Cathedral disappears. The Tower of London disappears. Westminster Abbey disappears. Medieval streets disappear. Even the English language as we know it disappears. We continue backward until London itself becomes the Roman settlement of Londinium. The Romans arrived in Britain in the 1st century, and Londinium developed beside the River Thames. Its position offered access to a navigable river and connections with roads leading through the province. Water could carry people and goods, but the river also divided the landscape. A dependable crossing offered an enormous advantage. The Romans were experienced bridge builders. Across their empire, they constructed roads and crossings that allowed armies, administrators, merchants, animals, carts, messages, and supplies to move with remarkable efficiency. Some Roman bridges were monumental stone structures. Others relied heavily upon timber. At Londinium, archaeological evidence indicates that wooden bridges existed near the location later associated with London Bridge. The earliest crossing would have looked nothing like the bridge we know today. There were no graceful 19th century granite arches, and certainly no modern roadway. Timber piles could be driven into the riverbed to support a wooden structure above the water. The technology was practical, but the Thames imposed constant demands upon anything placed within it. The river through London is tidal. Its level rises and falls as tides move inland from the sea. Currents change, water presses against supports, and debris can travel downstream. Before modern embankments reshaped the Thames, the riverbanks themselves were less constrained than they are today. Mud, shallows, marshy edges, and changing water levels formed part of the landscape. Yet a bridge transformed that landscape in another way. Roads could converge upon it. Travelers approaching Londinium from the south could enter the settlement at a predictable point. Goods arriving overland could cross more easily. The bridge became part of the city's geography, influencing how people moved and where activity gathered. The Roman settlement grew into an important commercial center. Ships used the Thames. Warehouses and workshops appeared. Imported goods arrived from other parts of the Roman world. People walking across an early bridge might have heard languages and accents from places scattered across an empire stretching far beyond Britain. They would have crossed a river whose name would remain familiar almost 2,000 years later, though nearly everything surrounding them would eventually disappear. Roman rule in Britain ended in the early 5th century. Londinium declined, administrative systems changed, and the infrastructure maintained under Roman authority could no longer be assumed to survive. A wooden bridge is particularly unforgiving of neglect. Without continual repair, timber exposed to weather and water deteriorates. Supports can weaken, sections can fail. Eventually, a structure that once seemed permanent can vanish almost completely. The disappearance of one bridge, however, did not remove the reason for having a bridge there. London would grow again. Communities remained on both sides of the Thames, and as trade and travel increased, the value of a permanent crossing returned with them. During the early medieval centuries, wooden bridges again served London. Their exact forms changed, and records from the period are incomplete, but the crossing remained important. The settlement of Southwark developed on the southern side of the river, while London grew on the northern bank. The bridge connected roads coming from southern England with the city itself. For travellers, London Bridge gradually became something like a gateway. Someone approaching from the south did not simply cross water. The bridge marked the transition into one of the most important places in the kingdom. Merchants used it. Farmers bringing goods toward London used it. Messengers, soldiers, clergy, nobles, labourers, and ordinary families could all find themselves moving along the same narrow route. Its importance also made the bridge strategically valuable. Control the crossing, and movement into London from the south could be influenced. Damage the bridge, and an opponent's ability to cross the Thames could be disrupted. Protect it, and the bridge could become part of the city's defences. But wooden bridges remained vulnerable. Floods and currents could damage their supports. Fire could consume sections of the crossing. Warfare could destroy them deliberately. Repairs might replace one portion while another continued to age. The London Bridge of one generation could contain materials placed there by several earlier generations, patched and rebuilt as circumstances required. For centuries, that was simply part of life beside the river. London needed its bridge, so London kept repairing or replacing its bridge. By the 12th century, however, the city was becoming increasingly important and prosperous. A wooden crossing that required continual rebuilding was no longer enough. London was ready for something far more ambitious, a permanent bridge built from stone. The undertaking would be enormous. Medieval builders would have to create foundations within a tidal river using tools and methods that seem remarkably simple by modern standards. Massive piers would need to resist the Thames. Stone arches would have to carry enormous weight. Construction would continue not for months or even a few years, but for decades. The man traditionally associated with this great undertaking was Peter of Colechurch, a priest and bridge builder whose name would become inseparable from Old London Bridge. Work on the new stone crossing began in the year 1176. What rose slowly from the Thames would become one of the most extraordinary bridges in European history. It would carry houses, shops, travellers, carts, animals, merchants, and generations of Londoners. It would survive fires and political upheaval. Its narrow arches would transform the flow of the river beneath it. It would stand for more than 600 years. And eventually, even that seemingly permanent bridge would have to come down. London would build another in its place. That next great replacement would be the bridge whose granite stones, centuries later, would make an almost unbelievable journey from the River Thames to the Arizona desert. The Great Stone Bridge, begun in the year 1176, represented a completely different ambition from the timber crossings London had relied upon before it. Peter of Colechurch, the priest traditionally associated with the project, was attempting to create something that could endure in a place where earlier bridges had repeatedly required repair and replacement. Building in stone offered permanence, but it also created challenges on a scale that medieval London had rarely confronted. Every pier had to be established in the moving water of the Thames, Enormous quantities of stone had to be transported and shaped, and the work had to continue while the river remained an essential route for boats carrying goods into and out of the city. The project would outlive Peter himself, who died before the bridge was completed, and construction continued for more than 3 decades before the crossing was finally finished in the early years of the 13th century. When Old London Bridge was complete, it stretched roughly 900 feet across the Thames and rested upon a long series of stone piers supporting 19 arches. These arches were not broad and widely spaced like those of many later bridges. The piers were substantial, and protective structures built around their bases occupied still more of the river. Together they created narrow openings through which a tremendous amount of tidal water had to pass. As the Thames rose and fell, the difference in water level on opposite sides of the bridge could turn those openings into turbulent channels. Passing beneath the bridge by boat became a skill of its own, and attempting it under unfavorable conditions could be dangerous. The expression of shooting the bridge came to describe the experience of taking a small boat through one of the arches, where the water could accelerate dramatically between the piers. Above this restless water stood something even more remarkable. Old London Bridge did not remain an open roadway, bordered only by railings. Buildings began to occupy it, and over time the bridge developed into a narrow inhabited street suspended across the Thames. Houses rose above shops. Merchants sold goods to the constant flow of people moving between London and Southwark. Upper stories projected outward beyond the structures beneath them, making some buildings appear to lean over the river. From a distance, the bridge could resemble a tightly packed strip of the city that somehow continued straight across the water. For someone entering London from the south, crossing the bridge must have been an extraordinary experience. The river could become almost invisible once a traveller entered the crowded roadway. Buildings stood close on either side, signs hung above shops, carts competed for limited space, animals were driven through the traffic, and pedestrians moved among merchants and travellers. Openings between the buildings occasionally offered glimpses of the Thames below, but much of the crossing felt less like a bridge than a busy street. Beneath all of this activity, water continued rushing through the arches while boats maneuvered around the piers. The bridge was not merely a route into London. It became a place where people lived and worked. Generations could grow up with the Thames flowing directly beneath their homes. Shopkeepers benefited from a remarkable commercial advantage because nearly everyone travelling into or out of London by the Southern Road had to pass their doors. Space was valuable, and buildings changed repeatedly as owners expanded, repaired, combined, or replaced them. At various times, some structures reached several stories in height, creating a skyline above the bridge that would look almost impossible to modernize, accustomed to open roadways and unobstructed views. Among the most distinctive buildings was a chapel dedicated to St. Thomas Becket. The chapel stood near the center of the bridge and was built partly into the structure itself, with spaces extending downward toward the river. For medieval travelers, religion was woven naturally into everyday life, and a chapel on such an important crossing provided a place for prayer during journeys into or out of London. Peter of Colechurch himself was reportedly buried within the chapel after his death, placing the man associated with the bridge permanently inside the structure he had helped begin. The bridge also became deeply connected with London's political history, sometimes in ways far darker than its shops and houses might suggest. For centuries, the Southern Gateway became associated with the public display of the heads of people executed for treason. These gruesome warnings were intended to be seen by travelers approaching the capital. Among those whose heads were displayed in connection with London Bridge were figures remembered from major struggles in English history. The practice belonged to an age when punishment was deliberately public, and when the entrance to a city could be used to demonstrate the authority of the crown. Yet everyday life continued around these grim reminders. Bread was sold, goods changed hands, residents looked from windows toward the river, and thousands of ordinary journeys passed over the bridge. That contrast is one reason Old London Bridge holds such a powerful place in London's history. It was simultaneously an engineering structure, a neighborhood, a marketplace, a gateway, a religious site, a political symbol, and a dangerous obstacle to navigation. Few bridges in the world have ever carried so many different roles at once. Its long life also meant that Old London Bridge witnessed London change around it in ways its original builders could never have imagined. When construction began in the 12th century, London was a medieval city of relatively modest size. Over the following centuries, its population grew, trade expanded, ships arrived from increasingly distant ports, and the city became the center of a kingdom whose influence would eventually reach around the world. Buildings on the bridge were rebuilt in newer styles, while the stone piers beneath them continued doing the work for which they had been constructed generations earlier. Fire was a constant threat. Houses and shops contained timber, cooking fires, candles, fireplaces, stored goods, and countless opportunities for flames to spread. London itself suffered repeated fires, and the bridge did not escape them. One particularly destructive fire occurred in the year 1213, only a short time after the stone bridge had been completed. According to accounts of the disaster, fires developed on both ends of the bridge, trapping people who had moved onto the crossing. Large numbers were reported killed, although medieval estimates of casualties are difficult to verify precisely. Whatever the exact total, the event demonstrated that a bridge made from stone could still carry buildings that were terribly vulnerable to flame. Centuries later, the Great Fire of London in the year 1666 devastated much of the city north of the Thames. London Bridge survived the catastrophe better than many nearby areas, partly because an earlier fire had left a gap in the buildings that acted as a break against the advancing flames. The bridge nevertheless existed within a city transformed by disaster. Medieval neighborhoods disappeared, streets were reconstructed, and London's architecture began changing, while the old stone crossing continued carrying traffic over the river. By then, Old London Bridge was already ancient. Its original medieval builders had been gone for hundreds of years, yet their piers still stood in the Thames. Repairs were continual, because surviving for centuries did not mean remaining unchanged. Stones were replaced, buildings were altered, supports were maintained, and successive generations inherited responsibility for keeping the crossing usable. The bridge survived not because medieval construction was magically indestructible, but because London kept investing labor and resources in maintaining something the city could not easily do without. The houses above the bridge increasingly became a problem as traffic grew. A roadway that had once accommodated medieval carts and pedestrians was now being asked to serve a much larger and busier city. congestion could become severe. Two directions of traffic had to squeeze through a narrow route hemmed in by buildings, and attempts were made to impose rules governing which side travelers should use. In the 18th century, London finally began removing the houses and shops from the bridge. Structures that had defined its appearance for generations disappeared, opening the roadway and revealing the river again. The removal of the buildings improved conditions above the bridge, but another problem remained below. The numerous piers continued restricting the Thames. Their foundations and protective structures occupied so much space that the river was forced through relatively narrow arches, creating differences in water level and dangerous currents. The bridge had been designed for medieval London, and although centuries of repair had kept it functioning, there was only so much that alteration could accomplish. A city entering the modern industrial age required a crossing designed for a different scale of traffic and commerce. By the late 18th century, engineers and city officials increasingly understood that Old London Bridge could not continue indefinitely. It had survived for more than 600 years, an astonishing lifespan for any heavily used piece of infrastructure. During those centuries, dynasties had risen and fallen, wars had been fought, London's population had multiplied, ships had changed, streets had changed, and entire neighborhoods had been rebuilt. The bridge had endured long enough for the city around it to become almost unrecognizable from the London in which Peter of Colechurch had begun his work. A replacement would require an engineer capable of designing for the new age. Britain was entering a period of extraordinary engineering ambition. Canals were being cut through the countryside, roads were improving, steam power was beginning to transform industry, and engineers were learning to build structures on a scale that earlier generations could scarcely have attempted. Among the leading figures of this world was John Rennie, a Scottish engineer whose work included bridges, canals, docks, harbours, and major civil engineering projects. Rennie was born in Scotland in the year 1761 and developed a reputation for combining careful engineering with monumental stone architecture. He worked during a period when civil engineering was emerging as a recognizable profession, and the challenges presented by the Thames were exactly the sort that demanded technical knowledge on a large scale. London needed a bridge capable of carrying increasing traffic while allowing the river to flow more freely beneath it. Rennie's design for a new London Bridge replaced the forest of narrow medieval arches with 5 broad stone arches. The difference was significant. Fewer piers meant less obstruction in the Thames, while a wider roadway above could accommodate the growing movement of people and vehicles. The new structure would be massive, elegant, and unmistakably a product of the 19th century rather than the Middle Ages. The material chosen for much of its visible exterior was granite. Granite is exceptionally durable, but it is also heavy and difficult to work. Large quantities were quarried, cut, transported, and assembled into a bridge intended to withstand enormous loads. The scale of the project reflected London's increasing wealth and importance. This was no temporary crossing. The new London Bridge was intended to become one of the great permanent works of the capital. John Rennie would never see it completed. He died in the year 1821, before construction of the bridge based upon his design had properly begun. Responsibility for bringing the project to completion passed to his son, John Rennie the Younger, who was himself an accomplished engineer. Under his supervision, construction began during the 1820s, a short distance upstream from the medieval bridge, allowing the old crossing to continue carrying traffic while its successor rose beside it. For several years, Londoners could witness an unusual scene on the Thames. The bridge that had served their city since the Middle Ages remained in use while the arches of its replacement gradually took shape nearby. One represented centuries of accumulated history, repairs, alterations, and memories. The other represented a new industrial century, confident in engineering, stonework, and the ability to reshape the city for the future. Building the new bridge required foundations capable of supporting enormous masonry arches in the riverbed. Stone had to be positioned with great precision because an arch distributes its load through compression, allowing the pieces to support one another once the structure is complete. During construction, temporary frameworks known as centering supported the developing arches until the final stones were placed and the arch could carry itself. It was painstaking work, but the result had a visual simplicity that concealed the complexity of everything beneath it. The completed bridge consisted of 5 graceful granite arches stretching across the Thames. Its roadway was far more open than that of the medieval crossing, with none of the houses and shops that had once made London Bridge resemble a neighbourhood over the river. Pedestrians could cross with views along the Thames, while boats below had substantially wider passages between the piers. The new London Bridge officially opened in the year 1831. King William IV and Queen Adelaide attended the opening celebrations, marking the beginning of a new chapter at one of London's oldest crossing points. The medieval bridge nearby, after more than 6 centuries of service, was subsequently dismantled. Its stones were dispersed and reused, and the bridge that had carried houses, shops, chapels, travellers, and generations of Londoners finally disappeared from the Thames. Rennie's Bridge inherited the old name without needing any further explanation. It was simply London Bridge. The city had replaced the structure, but preserved the identity of the crossing, continuing the pattern that had existed for centuries. Someone walking onto the new bridge was using a completely different piece of engineering from the medieval bridge. Yet in the language of London, they were still crossing London Bridge. This is the bridge that matters most to the extraordinary journey ahead. Its granite would one day leave England. Its stones would be marked with numbers. Cranes would lift pieces away. Ships would carry them across the Atlantic and through the Panama Canal. Trucks would haul them through the American Southwest. But none of that could have been imagined when the bridge opened in the year 1831. At that moment, the new structure represented London's future, not something the city would eventually sell. The London surrounding it was already changing quickly. The 19th century would bring explosive population growth, industrialization, railways, expanding docks, new suburbs, gaslighting, improved roads, and eventually technologies that transformed the speed at which people and goods moved through the capital. The bridge designed for the traffic of the early 1800s would remain in place while London became one of the largest cities in the world. At first, much of the traffic crossing Rennie's Bridge still belonged to an older world. Horse-drawn carts carried goods. Carriages transported passengers. Pedestrians crossed in large numbers. Omnibuses drawn by horses became increasingly familiar sights. The granite arches beneath them seemed immensely strong, and compared with the crowded medieval bridge that had preceded them, the open roadway represented a dramatic improvement. Yet the bridge's very success helped create new pressures. London continued expanding. More people meant more journeys. More commerce meant more goods crossing the river. The streets feeding into London Bridge became some of the busiest routes in the capital. The bridge did not stand in isolation. Every change in the city around it eventually reached its roadway. Railways transformed the area particularly dramatically. London Bridge Station opened nearby during the 1830s and developed into an increasingly important railway terminus. Passengers arriving by train poured into streets close to the bridge. South London expanded, and commuting patterns changed. A crossing designed before the railway age was now serving a city knitted together by steam locomotives. Throughout the Victorian era, the Thames itself changed as well. Docks, warehouses, steamships, embankments, and major public works altered the river and its surroundings. Other bridges were constructed, giving London additional crossings and relieving some pressure. But London Bridge retained enormous importance because of its position in the commercial heart of the city. The granite structure became part of everyday London. That familiarity can make it easy to forget how remarkable the bridge's later fate would be. For generations, people walked across it on their way to work, without imagining that the stones beneath their feet would one day stand beside palm trees. Horse-drawn vehicles crossed it, without anyone imagining automobiles traveling across the same granite exterior in Arizona. Rain darkened its stone, London fog surrounded its lamps, and the tidal Thames moved beneath its arches year after year. By the end of the 19th century, however, even Rennie's broad roadway was struggling with the volume of traffic. The bridge had already been widened during its life to accommodate growing demand. This was an early warning of a problem that would become much more serious during the next century. London was changing faster than even an enormous granite bridge could easily accommodate. Then came the motor vehicle. At first, automobiles were novelties, sharing streets with horses and carriages. Gradually, they became common. Buses grew larger and heavier. Commercial vehicles carried loads that would have been difficult to imagine when Rennie prepared his design. Traffic became not only more numerous, but heavier, faster, and more continuous. A stone arch bridge carries weight differently from a modern steel structure. Its enormous masonry mass is part of its strength, with forces transferred through the arches into the piers and foundations. Rennie's bridge had been built exceptionally well, but its foundations were still resting within a river environment that could change over time. The Thames moved around them every day, and the bridge was being asked to support conditions its designers could never have fully anticipated. By the early 20th century, engineers had reason to watch the structure carefully. Measurements eventually showed that the bridge was settling unevenly. The eastern side was sinking more than the western side, and by the year 1924, the difference had become measurable in inches. A few inches across something as massive as London Bridge might not sound dramatic, but bridges are structures in which small movements matter. Uneven settlement can alter how forces pass through masonry and indicate changes occurring beneath foundations that cannot be seen from the roadway above. The bridge was not suddenly collapsing, and Londoners were not watching granite arches tumble into the Thames. The problem was much slower and less theatrical. the structure was gradually becoming unsuitable for the demands placed upon it. Traffic continued growing, and the 20th century city needed a crossing capable of carrying streams of buses, trucks, automobiles, and pedestrians every day. Engineers monitored the bridge while London continued using it. Decades passed. The city endured 2 world wars. The Thames remained a central part of London's commercial and civic life, and Rennie's Bridge continued doing the job for which it had been built more than a century earlier. By the 1960s, however, the conclusion had become increasingly difficult to avoid. London Bridge needed to be replaced again. This was hardly unprecedented. London had been replacing bridges at this crossing for nearly 2,000 years. Roman timber had disappeared. Medieval wooden structures had come and gone. Peter of Colechurch's great stone bridge had eventually been dismantled. Rennie's Bridge was simply the next structure to reach the end of its useful life in London. But this time, someone asked a very unusual question. If London no longer needed its bridge, did the bridge itself really have to disappear? The answer would come from thousands of miles away, beside a reservoir in the Arizona desert, where an American businessman was trying to persuade people to build a new life in a city that barely existed. Somehow, the problem of an aging granite bridge in London was about to meet the problem of attracting attention to a remote development in Arizona, and the solution would become one of the strangest real estate stories of the 20th century. The American businessman, whose ambitions would eventually reach all the way to London, was Robert Paxton McCulloch, a man already accustomed to building businesses around machines, transportation, and bold ideas. Born in the early 20th century, McCulloch became associated with several manufacturing ventures and eventually built a name familiar to many Americans through McCulloch chainsaws. His business interests also included outboard motors, and it was partly the search for a suitable place to test those motors that drew his attention toward a vast body of water surrounded by desert along the Arizona and California border. The landscape could hardly have been more different from the grey tidal Thames. Here there were rugged mountains, enormous stretches of open sky, intense summer heat, and the blue water of Lake Havasu, a reservoir created after the construction of Parker Dam on the Colorado River during the 1930s. Lake Havasu was relatively young compared with the ancient waterways of Europe. Parker Dam had transformed part of the Colorado River into a reservoir stretching for miles through the desert, creating a large expanse of water useful for power, water management, recreation, and, in McCulloch's case, testing marine equipment. The shoreline offered open space that would have been nearly impossible to find around a mature metropolitan area. McCulloch acquired land on the Arizona side and began to imagine something far larger than a testing site. Instead of merely using the desert, he could build a community there. The idea required considerable imagination, because the location lacked many of the things that normally encourage a city to grow. There was no old town waiting to expand, no major industrial center nearby, and no long-established transportation network bringing thousands of people through the area each day. Much of the surrounding landscape was sparsely populated desert. Anyone trying to create a new community there would need to persuade people not simply to purchase a house, but to believe that an entire city could develop around them. McCulloch worked with developer C.V. Wood, whose career had already included involvement in the planning and early development of Disneyland. Wood understood how carefully designed places could capture people's imagination, and the partnership suited McCulloch's willingness to think on an unusually large scale. In the year 1963, Lake Havasu City was established on the eastern shore of the reservoir. Streets were laid out, lots were offered for sale, and the beginnings of a community appeared where desert had dominated only a short time before. Selling land was one thing, convincing prospective residents to travel to a remote part of Arizona to see it was another. McCulloch developed an aggressive promotional strategy involving charter flights that brought prospective buyers to Lake Havasu City. People could be flown into the area, shown the lake, the planned streets, available lots, and the vision for what the community might become. Thousands of potential buyers were introduced to the development in this way. It was an expensive approach, but McCulloch understood that people were far more likely to imagine themselves living beside Lake Havasu if they could actually stand there and see the blue water against the desert mountains. Even with those efforts, the young city faced a problem shared by many planned communities. It needed an identity. Established cities accumulate landmarks naturally over generations. A cathedral may have stood for centuries. A courthouse might be associated with important events. A famous street, park, monument, or building becomes shorthand for the place itself. Lake Havasu City had almost none of that accumulated history. It was new by design, and newness alone was not necessarily enough to persuade the rest of the country to remember its name. Thousands of miles away, London was confronting the opposite problem. It possessed more history than it could possibly preserve unchanged, and one of its most recognizable pieces of infrastructure had reached the end of its useful life. Rennie's London Bridge had served the city since the year 1831, but by the 1960s, its uneven settlement and the demands of modern traffic meant that replacement was inevitable. London needed a new bridge capable of serving the city for decades to come, while the old granite structure presented a practical question about what should happen to an enormous amount of historic stone. The City of London decided to offer the bridge for sale. The concept immediately had a slightly surreal quality. Bridges were not normally thought of as objects that could be purchased and taken home. A person could buy a painting, an antique table, a building, or a parcel of land, and understand roughly what ownership meant. Buying London Bridge was different. The bridge occupied a working river crossing in one of the busiest cities in the world. It weighed many thousands of tons, and whoever acquired it would still face the enormous expense of taking it apart and doing something with the pieces. The sale, nevertheless, had logic behind it. Much of the bridge's visible exterior consisted of valuable granite, and the structure possessed historical and cultural significance that ordinary demolition rubble did not. Finding a buyer could help offset some of the costs associated with removing the bridge, while allowing at least part of the old structure to survive elsewhere. The challenge was finding someone with enough money, imagination, and practical purpose to make such an unlikely purchase worthwhile. News of the opportunity eventually reached McCulloch. For a developer searching for a landmark capable of putting Lake Havasu City on the map, London Bridge was difficult to surpass. The name was already recognized throughout the English-speaking world. People who had never visited Britain knew it from history, photographs, and of course, the childhood rhyme. Instead of spending years trying to create a new landmark and hoping it became famous, McCulloch could acquire one whose name had been familiar for centuries. The idea sounded audacious, even by the standards of large-scale real estate promotion. Lake Havasu City was a young settlement in the Arizona desert, while London Bridge belonged to a city founded nearly 2,000 years earlier. One stood beside a reservoir on the Colorado River system beneath desert sunshine, while the other crossed the tidal Thames beneath London's frequently grey skies. Their histories had no natural reason to intersect. McCulloch's proposal would connect them anyway. There was also something unusually clever about the publicity value of the purchase. Simply announcing that an American had bought London Bridge was enough to generate curiosity. The statement almost sounded like the beginning of a joke or an impossible newspaper headline. People wanted to know why anyone would buy it, how much it cost, what exactly the buyer received, how a bridge could possibly be moved, and where it would go. Each question created another reason to talk about Lake Havasu City. McCulloch submitted the successful bid in the year 1968. The purchase price was $2,460,000. One often repeated account explains the unusual figure by saying that McCulloch began with an estimate of the cost involved in dismantling the bridge and added $60,000, representing $1,000 for each year of his age at the time. Whether remembered primarily for that calculation or simply for its scale, the purchase transformed an aging piece of London infrastructure into one of the most unusual antiques ever sold. The transaction did not mean that McCulloch had purchased every hidden structural component exactly as it stood and would somehow transport an intact bridge across the Atlantic. The practical value lay especially in the exterior granite masonry. Rennie's Bridge had been constructed as a massive stone structure, but recreating the entire 19th century bridge in precisely the same structural form in Arizona would have been unnecessarily difficult and enormously heavy. The plan that developed was far more practical: preserve the historic granite exterior and use it as the facing of a modern structure built to carry contemporary traffic. Almost immediately, a legend began growing around the purchase, and it has survived remarkably well. According to the story, McCulloch thought he was buying Tower Bridge rather than London Bridge. Tower Bridge, with its twin Gothic towers and opening central roadway, is one of the most recognizable structures in London. To visitors unfamiliar with the city's bridges, it can seem like the bridge that ought to be called London Bridge, simply because it looks so dramatically characteristic of London. The actual London Bridge McCulloch purchased was much plainer, consisting of broad stone arches without towers. The mistaken identity story is amusing because it imagines an American millionaire arriving in Britain, spending millions of dollars, and only later discovering that he had purchased the wrong landmark. There is no good evidence that this happened. McCulloch denied that he had confused the two bridges, and the people involved in a transaction of this scale knew what structure was being sold. The myth, nevertheless, became irresistible because it added another layer of absurdity to an already extraordinary story. In reality, London Bridge made sense for McCulloch precisely because of its name and history. Tower Bridge might have been visually more dramatic, but it was not for sale, and London Bridge carried a cultural recognition extending far beyond its appearance. The childhood rhyme alone had made the words familiar to millions of Americans. The bridge could become a destination not because everyone immediately recognized its architecture, but because people recognized its identity. With the purchase complete, attention shifted to the much more difficult problem of removal. A bridge cannot simply be placed on the back of a truck. The granite exterior had to be dismantled systematically, with pieces identified so they could later be used in the reconstruction. Workers began removing blocks from the bridge while London prepared for the new crossing that would replace it. This is where the numbered stones visible in historical photographs become such an important part of the story. Individual granite blocks were marked according to a coding system that helped identify their position. Instead of reducing the bridge to an anonymous pile of stone, workers were effectively creating an enormous three-dimensional puzzle. A piece removed from one portion of an arch needed to remain identifiable after it had traveled thousands of miles away. More than 10,000 granite blocks would ultimately be involved in the reconstruction project. Each represented only a small portion of the enormous bridge, but together they preserved the surface Londoners had known for generations. The blocks varied in size and shape according to their original positions. Some belonged to the curves of arches, others to walls and exterior surfaces, and each had to be handled as part of a larger system rather than as interchangeable building material. Dismantling proceeded carefully because granite is durable but not indestructible. A block could be chipped or cracked if handled badly, and 19th century stonework that had already endured more than a century beside the Thames deserved more care than ordinary demolition debris. Cranes lifted pieces from the structure, while workers documented and organized them. The process transformed London Bridge from a continuous landmark into rows and stacks of numbered stone. For Londoners, the scene must have been unusual. The bridge had carried traffic throughout living memory and had stood there long before anyone watching its removal had been born. Now pieces were being lifted away one by one. Behind the work lay the knowledge that London was not simply repairing the bridge this time. Rennie's Crossing was leaving permanently, and a completely new London Bridge would eventually occupy the site. The dismantling also created one of those rare moments when the hidden construction of a familiar landmark became visible. Most people experience a bridge only from its finished surfaces. They see the roadway, parapets, arches, lamps, and water beneath. Removal reverses the process of construction and exposes how pieces relate to one another. With each granite block lifted away, the bridge became less like an object and more like a collection of components waiting for another purpose. Some of the numbering marks associated with the move can still be seen on stones at Lake Havasu today, small reminders of the enormous organizational task behind the relocation. They are easy to overlook beside the scale of the completed bridge, but each mark represents a moment when that stone ceased being merely part of London Bridge and became a piece scheduled for a journey. The journey itself was remarkable. Arizona lies deep within the American Southwest, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. Before a granite block could reach Lake Havasu, it had to leave Britain, cross an ocean, reach the western side of North America, and then travel inland through desert country. Moving thousands of heavy stones directly across the United States from an eastern port would have required a tremendous amount of overland transport, so the shipment followed a route that took advantage of maritime travel. The dismantled granite was transported from Britain by ship. The cargo crossed the Atlantic and continued toward the Panama Canal, one of the great engineering works of the 20th century. The canal allowed vessels to pass between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans without making the vastly longer journey around the southern tip of South America. In an odd meeting of engineering histories, stones cut for a 19th century British bridge now pass through a 20th century canal on their way to become part of another bridge in America. The voyage through the Panama Canal placed London Bridge on a route that its designers could never have imagined. When John Rennie developed his plans around the beginning of the 19th century, the Panama Canal did not exist. Arizona was not yet an American state. Lake Havasu City did not exist, and even the reservoir beside which it would be built was more than a century in the future. Yet pieces of Rennie's bridge were now moving through all of these later creations, carried toward a destination that had not existed when the granite was first quarried. After passing through the canal and entering the Pacific, the shipment continued north toward California. The granite eventually reached the port of Long Beach, one of the major ports serving Southern California. There, the journey by water ended. Lake Havasu City was still hundreds of miles away, beyond the coastal region and across stretches of inland desert. Trucks took over for the final portion of the trip. Loads of historic granite traveled along American roads toward Arizona, an image almost as strange as the ocean voyage itself. Stones that had spent more than a century beside the Thames now passed through a landscape of dry mountains, open desert, roadside towns, and brilliant sunlight. The physical contrast between origin and destination could scarcely have been greater. The first truckloads reached Lake Havasu City in the summer of the year 1968. Their arrival transformed McCulloch's publicity stunt into a very real construction challenge. Buying the bridge had produced headlines. Moving the stones had demonstrated that the plan was serious. Now the young city had to turn thousands of numbered pieces into something that looked and functioned like London Bridge. The reconstruction would be supervised with reference to copies of the original plans, and architect Robert Beresford became closely associated with the project. The goal was not to create a loose, decorative imitation. The new bridge needed to preserve the recognizable proportions and exterior appearance of Rennie's structure while relying upon modern engineering internally. That distinction is crucial to understanding what stands in Arizona today. A reinforced concrete structure would provide the principal modern support. The old granite blocks could then be used as exterior facing, giving the completed bridge the historic surface and appearance associated with the London structure, without requiring Arizona builders to recreate every massive 19th century masonry component exactly as it had existed over the Thames. The approach also reduced the amount of historic stone needed for purely structural purposes and allowed the bridge to meet the practical demands of its new location. Before all of that could happen, however, Lake Havasu City had to decide exactly where the bridge would stand. The chosen location created one of the most surprising chapters of the entire relocation. Today, photographs show London Bridge spanning blue water, and it is natural to assume builders selected an existing channel and constructed the bridge across it in the usual way. That is not what happened. This unusual sequence made sense because builders could work without having to construct foundations and arches in an active waterway as Rennie's crews had done on the Thames. The modern bridge could rise on solid ground, surrounded by the desert landscape of the young city. Only afterward would the geography around it be transformed, so that water flowed beneath its arches. A ceremonial cornerstone was laid in September of the year 1968, marking the beginning of reconstruction. The event reinforced the project's symbolic importance to Lake Havasu City. This was not simply a road crossing being built because traffic needed to reach the other side. It was the centerpiece of a larger vision for the community, a landmark intended to give a new American city an instant connection with centuries of history. Construction continued over several years. The numbered granite pieces were sorted and incorporated into the exterior, while the modern structure took shape beneath them. Workers who had never seen the bridge in London were assembling material that had once formed part of one of Britain's most heavily travelled crossings. Each completed section made the Arizona structure look increasingly familiar, even though everything surrounding it remained unmistakably desert. The contrast was part of the attraction. Granite arches associated with London rose against distant mountains and an enormous southwestern sky. Palm trees and desert vegetation replaced the dense urban buildings that had once surrounded the bridge. Instead of the tidal Thames, there was dry ground beneath the arches during construction. The bridge looked as though a piece of one landscape had been lifted from its surroundings and set down inside another. Yet the project was not finished simply because the roadway and arches were complete. McCulloch wanted the bridge to cross water, and the development plan called for a navigable channel connecting portions of Lake Havasu around the land on which the bridge stood. Engineers and construction crews therefore undertook the unusual task of creating the waterway after the bridge was already in place. Earth was excavated beneath and beyond the completed structure to form what became Bridgewater Channel. When water was allowed into the channel, the landscape changed dramatically. The land beyond the bridge, previously connected to the mainland as a peninsula, became an island. Boats could move through the new channel, and London Bridge finally had water beneath its arches again. Once water filled Bridgewater Channel and began passing beneath the reconstructed arches, London Bridge finally looked at home again, although almost everything surrounding it would have seemed impossible to the people who had built Rennie's original structure. Instead of the dense streets of 19th century London, the bridge now stood beneath a wide Arizona sky. Instead of warehouses, railway stations, church towers, and tightly packed buildings, its surroundings included desert mountains, palms, new roads, and a community still in the process of establishing itself. The water below was not the tidal Thames flowing toward the North Sea, but part of Lake Havasu, a reservoir on the Colorado River system. Even the sunlight transformed the appearance of the granite, illuminating stones that generations of Londoners had more often known beneath the softer light, cloud, rain, and fog of Britain. The engineering hidden beneath those familiar stones was different as well. From a distance, the Arizona Bridge could easily be mistaken for the same massive masonry structure that had crossed the Thames, but the historic granite was now functioning primarily as an exterior, facing around a modern reinforced concrete structure. This was an important practical decision. Rebuilding Rennie's Bridge exactly as it had existed in London would have required recreating an enormous 19th century stone structure whose sheer weight had been part of the difficulty at its original site. In Arizona, modern concrete could provide the strength required for traffic, while the old granite preserved the bridge's historic appearance and physical connection to London. The distinction sometimes leads to arguments over whether London Bridge was truly moved or merely copied, but neither extreme describes the project particularly well. The bridge was not transported intact, and its 19th century structural system was not recreated stone for stone. At the same time, this was not simply a modern imitation, decorated to resemble the old bridge. Thousands of granite blocks that had genuinely formed the exterior of Rennie's London Bridge were dismantled, transported across the world, and incorporated into the Arizona crossing. The result is best understood as a modern bridge wearing the historic stone exterior of its London predecessor, preserving a remarkable amount of original material while adapting it to a completely different engineering environment. The new construction also created unexpected spaces within the bridge. Because the Arizona structure was not a solid mass of masonry built exactly like Rennie's original, portions of its interior were hollow. Over time, some of these protected spaces became attractive to bats. Hundreds have been reported using parts of the bridge as habitat, emerging after sunset into a landscape that would have been entirely foreign to the wildlife living around the Thames. It is a small detail compared with the enormous story of moving the bridge, but it illustrates how completely the structure entered a new ecosystem. London stone now provided shelter for Arizona animals beneath desert skies. Above the water, preparations continued for the moment when the project would finally be presented as a completed landmark. McCulloch understood that the bridge alone could attract attention, but the surrounding development could strengthen the connection with Britain. An English village was created near the bridge, using architecture and decorative details intended to evoke an idealized version of England. Visitors arriving in the Arizona desert could encounter British references, shops, signs, and architectural touches before walking toward a bridge whose granite had actually come from London. The English village was never meant to reproduce a particular London neighborhood with perfect historical accuracy. Its purpose was atmosphere. Lake Havasu City was embracing the improbable story that had suddenly given it an identity recognizable far beyond Arizona. British motifs made the contrast more playful and memorable. A visitor could spend the morning driving through desert country and then find a collection of English-inspired buildings beside a former London landmark. The unlikely combination was exactly what made the destination interesting. The completed London Bridge was formally dedicated in Lake Havasu City on October 10th in the year 1971. The event represented the culmination of more than 3 years of dismantling, transportation, reconstruction, excavation, and promotion. What had begun as a surprising purchase in the year 1968 had become a functioning American road bridge. According to local historical accounts, tens of thousands of spectators gathered for the celebration, joined by dignitaries and guests who came to witness the opening of a landmark unlike anything else in the Southwest. British and American imagery naturally surrounded the occasion. The entire project depended upon the bridge's connection to London, and the dedication celebrated that relationship rather than attempting to disguise it. The name remained London Bridge. Its history remained part of the attraction. Lake Havasu City had not purchased the granite in order to erase its previous life, but to make that life central to the new community's identity. the more clearly people understood that the stones had once stood over the Thames, the more extraordinary the Arizona Bridge became. For McCulloch, the dedication also marked the success of a marketing gamble that had initially sounded almost absurd. The purchase price alone had been more than $2 million, and dismantling, shipping, reconstruction, and surrounding development added substantially to the cost of the undertaking. Yet the value McCulloch sought could not be measured simply by comparing the price of granite with the cost of ordinary construction material. He was purchasing attention, recognition, and a story that newspapers, magazines, broadcasters, tourists, and prospective residents would repeat for decades. The strategy worked because the question behind the story was so easy to understand. Why was London Bridge in Arizona? Someone did not need to know anything about civil engineering or British history to find that strange. The phrase itself created curiosity. London and Arizona seemed to belong to entirely different worlds, and learning that an actual former London Bridge had been dismantled and transported there made the story even more memorable. That publicity mattered enormously to a city founded only 8 years before the bridge's dedication. Lake Havasu City had no centuries-old historic district and no generations of famous residents to draw upon. London Bridge provided a ready-made story that connected the young community to a much older history. Promotional material could show the granite arches against the desert landscape, and the image alone communicated that something unusual had happened there. Tourists came to see it. Some arrived because they already knew the relocation story, while others discovered the details after reaching the city. Walking across the bridge offered a peculiar connection with London, because the granite beneath and beside the roadway had once occupied one of the busiest crossings in Britain. Visitors could look closely at the stone and in some places find markings connected with the dismantling and reconstruction process, physical traces of the enormous puzzle that had been taken apart and assembled again. The bridge also became useful in a much more ordinary way. It carried traffic. This point can become lost beneath the novelty of its history. But the reconstructed London Bridge was not merely a monument placed beside the lake for people to admire. Vehicles travelled across it, pedestrians used it, and it connected the mainland portion of Lake Havasu City with the island created when Bridgewater Channel was excavated. The bridge therefore resumed the basic job bridges had performed at the London crossing for centuries, allowing people to move from one side of water to the other. Its new environment created an entirely different rhythm of use. On the Thames, Rennie's Bridge had served commuters, commercial traffic, horse-drawn vehicles, buses, trucks, and pedestrians moving through the center of one of the world's largest cities. At Lake Havasu, the bridge became associated with recreation as well as transportation. Boats moved through the channel beneath it. Visitors walked along the waterfront. Hotels, restaurants, shops, and recreational facilities developed nearby. The bridge became part of a landscape shaped around boating, tourism, and desert leisure. The water beneath it also behaved very differently from the Thames. London Bridge had originally stood over a tidal river, where water levels and currents changed with the movement of the sea. Lake Havasu's Bridgewater Channel was a deliberately created passage through a reservoir environment. The 19th century bridge had once interacted with the complicated tides and heavy river traffic of London, while its Arizona successor overlooked pleasure boats and calmer waters beneath a much drier climate. Even the granite began acquiring a different appearance. Stone responds subtly to its environment. Rain, pollution, moisture, temperature, biological growth and sunlight all affect surfaces over long periods. In London, the bridge had endured damp weather, soot, fog, industrial pollution, and the atmosphere of a crowded city. In Arizona, it encountered intense sun, heat, dry air, and a dramatically different pattern of weathering. The stones had crossed not merely a geographic distance, but a climatic boundary. Among the details that visitors sometimes notice are the bridge's lamps. The history surrounding London Bridge's lampposts has generated stories of its own, including the claim that some were made using metal from cannon captured from Napoleon's forces after the Battle of Waterloo. Such stories add another layer of European history to a structure already overflowing with it, although decorative features associated with bridges can be replaced, moved, restored, and reproduced over time, making it wise to distinguish carefully between documented history and local tradition. What matters for the larger story is how quickly almost every feature of the bridge became capable of attracting a tale. The granite itself carried more tangible marks of its previous life. Some stones show scars and surface damage that local accounts have associated with wartime London, including damage attributed to bombing or shrapnel during the Second World War. London suffered heavily during the Blitz, when German aircraft attacked the city beginning in the year 1940, and the areas around the Thames contained important transportation and commercial targets. The old bridge survived the war and continued carrying traffic afterward, eventually transporting some of its physical scars to Arizona along with its stone. Not every mark on an old block can be confidently assigned to one dramatic event. A bridge that spent well over a century in London experienced countless opportunities for chips, impacts, repairs, weathering, and damage. Still, the presence of visibly aged granite is part of what separates London Bridge from a newly manufactured replica. The stone does not look as though it was quarried yesterday, because it was not. Its irregularities belong to a long working life that began beside the Thames. Nature also claimed portions of the bridge in ways no developer needed to plan. Swallows became familiar seasonal residents around the structure, building mud nests beneath protected surfaces. Their small nests could gather in large numbers, and the birds added another layer of life to the arches. The bridge that had once stood amid the dense wildlife of an enormous human city now became habitat within a desert lake environment, shared by birds, bats, insects, boaters, motorists, and tourists. Stories of ghosts eventually arrived as well. This was perhaps inevitable. Any structure associated with centuries of London history, dismantled and carried across the world, is almost certain to acquire supernatural legends. Visitors and local storytellers have described unusual sounds, figures, or sensations around the bridge, sometimes imagining that something from its former life traveled with the granite. Such stories are part of folklore rather than established history, but they reveal how people respond to objects that seem displaced from their original time and place. A bridge with old stones invites imagination. The temptation to attach medieval ghosts to the Arizona Bridge demonstrates another common misunderstanding about its history. The granite at Lake Havasu came from the 19th century bridge not Peter of Colechurch's medieval Old London Bridge. Anyone imagining that the Arizona stones once supported the houses, chapel, and traitors' heads of the medieval crossing is combining two separate structures. The location and name connect them historically, but the physical stones belong to Rennie's Bridge, constructed many centuries later. That distinction does not make the Arizona Bridge less interesting. In some ways, it makes the real story more impressive, because Rennie's Bridge had a substantial history of its own. It served Victorian London during one of the most transformative periods in the city's existence. It witnessed the expansion of railways, the rise of steam transport, enormous population growth, the arrival of motor vehicles, 2 world wars, and the transformation of London into a modern metropolis. More than a century of London life passed across those granite surfaces before McCulloch ever saw them. The bridge also links 3 very different phases in the history of engineering. Its design came from the great stone masonry tradition of the early 19th century. Its relocation depended upon 20th century cranes, ships, trucks, global transportation networks, and the Panama Canal. Its reconstruction used reinforced concrete to create a modern structural core. Standing at Lake Havasu, the bridge therefore combines the appearance of one engineering age with the methods of another. Its journey can also be understood as an enormous exercise in adaptive reuse. Modern preservation often asks whether an old structure can be given a new purpose rather than destroyed. London Bridge provides an unusually dramatic example. The bridge could no longer efficiently serve its original location, but much of its historic material was not discarded. Instead, that material was transferred into a new structure, serving a new community. There were compromises, of course. The bridge lost its original relationship with the Thames, and context is part of history. Rennie's arches had been designed specifically for a particular river and city. Moving the granite meant separating it from the streets, buildings, currents, weather, and patterns of daily life that had surrounded it. Someone standing at Lake Havasu cannot experience the bridge exactly as a Victorian Londoner did, because almost everything beyond the stone has changed. At the same time, remaining in London would not necessarily have preserved the bridge intact. The city needed a new crossing, and Rennie's structure was going to be removed. Had McCulloch not purchased the granite, much more of it might have been dispersed, reused anonymously, or lost. Relocation preserved the exterior as a recognizable whole, even if that whole now exists in a radically different setting. Back in London, the crossing continued without it. A new London Bridge was constructed to replace Rennie's aging structure, maintaining the ancient continuity of the route. The modern bridge opened in the year 1973, only a couple of years after the Arizona Bridge was dedicated. London therefore entered an unusual period in which 2 functioning bridges carried the London Bridge identity in different ways. One occupied the historic crossing of the Thames and inherited the official name. The other stood in Arizona, carrying the granite exterior of the structure that had previously held that name. The modern London Bridge is much less ornate than many visitors expect, especially those arriving with images of Tower Bridge in mind. Its clean, functional appearance reflects the engineering priorities of the 20th century. It carries heavy traffic across the Thames, without the stone arches that defined Rennie's Bridge. Tourists sometimes still confuse it with Tower Bridge downstream, continuing the same misunderstanding that helped create the myth about McCulloch buying the wrong bridge. Tower Bridge itself remains one of the easiest landmarks in London to recognise. Completed near the end of the 19th century, its two towers and opening bascules create the dramatic silhouette seen on countless postcards and photographs. Because it is so visually distinctive, many people outside Britain instinctively call it London Bridge. The actual modern London Bridge appears almost modest by comparison, but its historical importance comes from the crossing rather than from elaborate architecture. This makes the McCulloch legend particularly persistent. Someone sees Tower Bridge, learns that London Bridge was sold to an American, then sees photographs of the much plainer bridge in Arizona and assumes there must have been a mistake. The story practically writes itself. Yet McCulloch's objective was not to obtain the most picturesque bridge in Britain. He wanted London Bridge, with the name, recognition, historical continuity, and publicity that came with it. The name proved powerful enough to outlive every structure that carried it. Roman crossings disappeared. Medieval timber bridges vanished. Old London Bridge was dismantled. Rennie's Bridge left the country. The modern bridge replaced it, and still the crossing remained London Bridge. The identity belonged almost as much to the place and idea as to any particular arrangement of stone, timber, or concrete. In Arizona, however, the name became attached permanently to a specific collection of historic granite. The city built around it, promoted it, and incorporated it into its identity. Businesses used bridge imagery. Tourism campaigns featured it. Visitors photographed it from boats and waterfront paths. What had once been ordinary infrastructure to millions of Londoners became something people deliberately traveled to Arizona to see. The effect on Lake Havasu City extended beyond tourism. A landmark helps create a sense of place, particularly in a planned community that begins without generations of inherited architecture. Residents could identify their city through the bridge. Events could be organized around it. Images of the arches immediately distinguished Lake Havasu from other desert communities. McCulloch's strange purchase became part of local history almost as quickly as the city itself developed. Population growth continued in the decades after the bridge opened. Homes spread across the surrounding desert. Roads expanded, and the lake became increasingly associated with boating and recreation. The city eventually grew to tens of thousands of residents, far beyond the small development McCulloch had been trying to promote when he first pursued the bridge. London Bridge was not the only reason for that growth, but it gave the community a level of recognition that would have been extraordinarily difficult to manufacture through conventional advertising. The bridge also became a place for ceremonies and anniversaries that maintained ties with Britain. Commemorations of the relocation have brought British themes, visitors, officials, and traditions back to Lake Havasu. Union flags and American flags can appear together around celebrations, emphasizing the unusual relationship created by the bridge. What began as a commercial transaction gradually became a cultural connection between two places separated by an ocean and a continent. For people who remember the nursery rhyme from childhood, arriving at Lake Havasu can produce a particularly strange reaction. The name that once belonged to a simple song suddenly appears on road signs in Arizona. There is the bridge, solid and unmistakable, stretching over blue water beneath desert sunshine. The immediate question is often the same one that made McCulloch's purchase such effective publicity in the first place. How did London Bridge end up here? The answer is both simpler and more remarkable than many legends suggest. It was not stolen, and no one secretly carried it away. McCulloch did not accidentally purchase the wrong bridge. The medieval bridge from the nursery rhyme was not transported across the Atlantic. London knowingly sold a 19th century bridge it needed to replace. An American developer knowingly purchased it. Workers carefully removed thousands of pieces of historic granite, and those pieces traveled by ship and truck to a city that wanted a landmark. What makes the story extraordinary is not that any single step was impossible. Every individual part could be solved with money, engineering, transportation, organization, and labor. The extraordinary part is that anyone decided to connect those steps in the first place. Selling an obsolete bridge made sense. Promoting a new city made sense. Shipping stone by sea made sense. Building a modern bridge made sense. Combining all of those practical decisions into a plan that moved London Bridge to Arizona was the leap of imagination. More than half a century after the dedication, that leap is still visible. Cars continue crossing the bridge. Boats continue passing beneath it. People walk along its sidewalks and stop to photograph the arches. Birds build nests beneath the stone. Bats shelter inside portions of the structure, and the desert sun rises and sets over granite that once stood beside the Thames. The bridge no longer performs the exact job John Rennie imagined for it, but it has not become a silent museum object either. It remains part of everyday life. That may be one of the most fitting outcomes for a structure carrying the name London Bridge. For nearly 2,000 years, the history of the crossing has never really been about preserving one bridge forever. It has been about adaptation. Timber gave way to new timber. Medieval crossings were repaired and rebuilt. Stone replaced wood. Rennie's Bridge replaced Old London Bridge. A modern concrete crossing replaced Rennie's Bridge in London, while Rennie's granite began another life in Arizona. Each generation kept what it could, changed what it needed, and continued crossing the water. The continued usefulness of London Bridge in Arizona is especially interesting because the structure has now spent more than half a century in its second home. When it was dedicated in the year 1971, many of the people attending the celebration could remember the bridge carrying traffic across the Thames. Some had walked over it in London, seen buses moving along its roadway, or watched the dismantling as cranes removed the granite. With each passing decade, however, the balance of its history changes. The Arizona chapter grows longer, while direct memories of Rennie's Bridge in London become increasingly rare. A landmark that once seemed newly transplanted has become an established part of the landscape around Lake Havasu, known by generations who have never experienced the city without it. That long second life has also allowed the bridge to accumulate an entirely new set of memories. Weddings have taken place nearby. Families have posed for photographs along the waterfront. Children have grown up crossing it, and visitors have returned decades after first seeing it. Boats passing through Bridgewater Channel have become as natural a sight beneath the arches as Thames traffic once was. For residents, the bridge can be both extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. Its history is unusual enough to attract people from around the world, yet it is also simply part of the route through town, a familiar structure encountered during everyday errands and local journeys. This dual identity resembles the role London Bridge played in England before the move. A famous landmark can become almost invisible to the people who use it every day. Londoners crossing Rennie's Bridge on their way to work were not necessarily thinking about John Rennie, medieval bridges, Roman crossings, or the future of the granite beneath them. They were trying to reach the other side of the Thames. In Arizona, a driver can cross stones that traveled from Britain while thinking about groceries, appointments, work, or what to have for dinner. History remains present, even when nobody is consciously paying attention to it. The stones themselves also reveal variations that are easy to miss in photographs. Granite blocks are not perfectly identical manufactured units. Their surfaces contain differences in texture, weathering, mineral patterns, edges, repairs, and scars accumulated during use. Some spent decades exposed to London weather before encountering the much harsher sunlight of Arizona. Seen closely, the bridge is less uniform than it appears from a distance, and that irregularity helps preserve the sense that its exterior has genuinely lived through two very different environments. The remarkable durability of granite is part of what made such a second life possible. Granite forms deep within the earth as molten rock cools slowly, allowing visible crystals to develop. Once quarried and cut, it can withstand enormous compressive forces and resist weathering for long periods. 19th century engineers valued it for precisely those qualities, although its weight made transportation and construction difficult. Rennie's builders could not have known that the same durability would later allow their stonework to survive dismantling, ocean shipment, overland transport, and reconstruction on another continent. Moving the granite also changed its historical meaning. In London, the stone had been part of a working bridge, whose importance came mainly from location. At Lake Havasu, the same material became valuable because of where it had been before. A block of granite that might have attracted little attention while sitting beside the Thames could become an object of curiosity in Arizona simply because visitors understood its journey. The physical material had not fundamentally changed, but the story surrounding it had. That transformation is one reason London Bridge is sometimes described as one of the largest antiques ever sold. The phrase captures the humor of treating a bridge like a collectible object, although the reality is more complicated because the Arizona structure combines historic material with modern construction. Unlike a chair, clock, or painting that can be moved intact, the bridge had to be dismantled and adapted, yet the transaction still involved purchasing something old, partly because its age, identity, and previous history gave it value beyond the raw materials from which it was made. The reconstruction also required decisions about what portions of the original material were worth shipping. The old bridge contained enormous quantities of masonry, and transporting every hidden stone would have added weight and cost, without necessarily preserving anything visible in the finished structure. The historic exterior blocks carried the recognizable surface, so these became the most important pieces to retain. Material not required for the Arizona reconstruction could remain behind or find other uses, while the numbered granite selected for transport became the visible skin of the new bridge. The new structural system also gave the Arizona Bridge advantages that Rennie's original could not have possessed. Reinforced concrete combines concrete's ability to withstand compression with embedded steel reinforcement that helps resist tension. By the 20th century, engineers could design a bridge with a strong internal framework while using the historic stone for appearance and preservation. The result retained the arches and visual character associated with the 19th century crossing without recreating the structural limitations that had contributed to its removal from London. The old bridge's problems had never meant that Rennie's design was poor. On the contrary, surviving nearly a century and a half under steadily increasing demands was evidence of impressive engineering. The difficulty was that cities change. A structure designed when horse-drawn vehicles dominated the roads eventually faced motorbuses, heavy trucks, automobiles, and traffic volumes no early 19th century engineer could reasonably have predicted. Even the ground beneath the bridge could change as river conditions, construction, dredging, and centuries of use affected the crossing. Uneven settlement had become one of the clearest signs that the bridge was reaching the end of its London service. The popular description that London Bridge was sinking is broadly rooted in this real problem, although it can create an exaggerated mental image of the entire structure disappearing dramatically into the Thames. The movement occurred gradually. Engineers could measure differences and monitor the bridge over time, allowing London to plan a replacement rather than waiting for a catastrophic failure. Creating the island also increased the practical importance of the bridge. Once the channel cut through the former peninsula, a crossing was genuinely necessary to maintain road access. What began as a landmark project became infrastructure connecting two pieces of the city. Boats gained a route through the channel, while vehicles used the bridge above, giving the area a layered transportation pattern that echoes, in a much quieter form, the relationship between roadway and river traffic in London. The contrast between the two waterways remains striking. The Thames has been used for trade and transportation for thousands of years, with tides carrying seawater influence deep into London. Bridgewater Channel is a modern human-made passage within a reservoir created by a dam. One existed long before the first bridge. The other was created partly because the bridge was there. The same granite has therefore stood above two bodies of water with almost opposite histories. Lake Havasu itself represents another transformation of landscape. Before Parker Dam, the Colorado River followed its course through the region, without the broad reservoir visible today. Dam construction changed water levels and created new shoreline, making possible the recreational lake that later attracted McCulloch. Without the dam, the particular setting that inspired Lake Havasu City would not have existed in the same form. The bridge's Arizona story therefore depended upon an earlier engineering project reshaping the river. Parker Dam was built during the 1930s, decades before McCulloch began developing the city. Located downstream from Lake Havasu City, the dam is notable for the large portion of its structure extending below the riverbed. Its creation formed the reservoir that became an important source of water as well as a recreational destination. The blue water surrounded by desert became one of the strongest selling points for McCulloch's development, providing the visual contrast that still defines the city. The lake also made the arrival of London Bridge more believable as a destination. A bridge needs water to make visual sense, and the reservoir offered a setting in which the old granite could become part of an attractive waterfront rather than a monument standing alone in the desert. Once Bridgewater Channel was opened, boats, beaches, and shoreline activity gave the bridge an entirely new kind of life. The project also arrived during a period when American mobility was reshaping the Southwest. Air conditioning expanding highways, post-war prosperity, retirement migration, and the growth of tourism made desert communities increasingly attractive to people who might once have considered the climate too remote or difficult. Cities across Arizona expanded rapidly during the second half of the 20th century, and Lake Havasu City participated in that broader movement while using its unusual landmark to distinguish itself. The English village beside the bridge played a similar role. Although its appearance and businesses changed over the decades, the original idea reinforced the sense that visitors were entering a small zone where British references had been transplanted into Arizona. Decorative architecture, signs, shops, and themed details extended the story beyond the granite arches themselves. The effect was playful rather than archaeologically precise, but precision was never the main purpose. The purpose was to create an experience people would associate with the bridge. That chapter has now lasted long enough to become history in its own right. The dedication in the year 1971 is no longer a recent curiosity, but an event more than half a century in the past. Photographs of the reconstruction have taken on the look of another era, with period clothing, machinery, automobiles, and construction methods surrounding the old stone. Lake Havasu City itself has matured around the bridge, changing the meaning of photographs that once showed a landmark rising amid relatively undeveloped desert. Today, the bridge can be photographed from angles that reveal hotels, restaurants, landscaped waterfronts, roads, homes, boats, and mature palms surrounding it. The city McCulloch was trying to sell is no longer an idea represented by lines on development maps. It exists around the object he purchased to attract attention to it, and the bridge that once needed Lake Havasu City as a new home eventually became the landmark by which many people recognize Lake Havasu City itself. The bridge also became more than the sum of the publicity surrounding its move, because people could physically experience it. Newspaper headlines might have created initial curiosity, but a visitor could actually walk across the structure, examine the granite, pass beneath its arches in a boat, and stand beside stone that had spent generations in London. That physical connection made the story unusually durable. Many promotional attractions eventually disappear once the novelty fades, but London Bridge remained useful infrastructure, ensuring that it stayed woven into the life of the city long after the original advertising campaign had ended. Pedestrians crossing today can look outward over Bridgewater Channel rather than the Thames, yet the basic experience of moving across water preserves the function for which the granite was originally shaped. Cars pass over the roadway while boats move below, creating a pattern that would have been familiar in principle to Londoners, even if the surroundings are entirely different. On the Thames, vessels once approached Rennie's Five Arches amid one of the busiest urban landscapes in Europe. At Lake Havasu, recreational craft glide beneath the bridge, while desert mountains remain visible beyond the shoreline. The scale and purpose of the waterways differ, but the relationship between bridge, road, and boat traffic continues. The bridge's presence also helped make the island beyond it one of the distinctive parts of Lake Havasu City. Before Bridgewater Channel was excavated, that land was connected to the mainland. Cutting the channel turned it into an island and gave the reconstructed bridge a genuine transportation purpose. Development followed, and the island became home to residences, recreational facilities, parks, and other destinations. A geographical feature that appears natural to someone arriving today was therefore partly the consequence of the decision to reconstruct London Bridge in that particular place. The historic stone therefore serves almost like an architectural record. Its importance does not depend upon every block performing precisely the same structural job it performed over the Thames. The granite matters because it was there. It formed the surfaces Londoners saw, touched, and passed beside. It endured London's weather, soot, traffic, wartime years, and changing skyline. Moving those surfaces preserved a physical link that a completely new replica could never provide. Historical photographs of the dismantling add a third stage between those two lives. In them, the bridge is neither fully London nor yet Arizona. Cranes stand over exposed masonry. Sections disappear. Blocks are marked and removed. Workers occupy spaces that ordinary pedestrians would never have seen while the bridge was in service. These images capture the brief period when London Bridge existed as a collection of pieces rather than as a complete crossing, and they reveal how much organization was required before reconstruction could begin. The numbering process was essential because stone arches depend upon geometry. Blocks shaped for curved portions cannot simply be placed anywhere. Exterior pieces around the arches, parapets, and walls had relationships to one another that builders wanted to preserve. Marking them allowed the reconstruction team to understand where material belonged, even after it had been removed from the context that made its purpose obvious. The numbers converted physical location into information, allowing the arrangement of the bridge to travel separately from the bridge itself. This method has parallels in other historic reconstruction projects. Buildings threatened by reservoirs, urban redevelopment, or archaeological excavation have sometimes been carefully documented, dismantled, and rebuilt elsewhere. Temples have been moved away from rising water. Historic houses have been shifted from one site to another. What makes London Bridge remarkable is the scale of the move and the enormous distance involved. It was not relocated to the next street or even another part of Britain. Its historic exterior crossed an ocean and a continent before reappearing in recognizable form. The international journey also depended upon transportation systems far removed from anything available when Rennie's Bridge was constructed. In the 1820s, moving such an enormous quantity of stone from London to the interior of North America would have been nearly unimaginable as a practical development project. By the late 1960s, global shipping, the Panama Canal, modern ports, heavy trucks, highways, cranes, and construction machinery made the idea difficult and expensive, but achievable. The bridge's relocation therefore tells a story, not only about preservation, but also about how dramatically transportation had changed during its lifetime. When the bridge first opened in London, steam railways were only beginning to emerge. By the time it was dismantled, humans had flown into space. The span of the bridge's first life covered technological changes so profound that the world at its removal would have seemed almost unrecognizable to the engineers who designed it. Horse-drawn traffic gave way to motor vehicles, sailing ships shared waterways with steamships, and then diesel-powered vessels. Telegraph lines gave way to telephones and broadcasting, and aircraft crossed distances that once required weeks of travel. The bridge quietly endured all of this because infrastructure often becomes a stable background against which technological change occurs. A person standing on Rennie's Bridge in the 1830s might have watched horse-drawn vehicles and wooden boats. Someone standing at nearly the same spot more than a century later could watch motor buses, automobiles, aircraft overhead, and modern ships on the Thames. The granite remained while almost everything moving around it changed. That stability makes the decision to remove the bridge feel dramatic in retrospect, but for London it was another practical response to growth. The city had already learned that preserving a crossing did not require preserving every bridge forever. When a structure could no longer serve its purpose efficiently, another could inherit the location and name. The modern London Bridge, completed in the 20th century, continues that tradition, while Rennie's granite survives elsewhere as evidence of an earlier stage. The nursery rhyme followed its own path alongside that physical history. Whatever its exact origin, the song became one of the most effective ways the name London Bridge travelled beyond Britain. Children who knew nothing about the Thames could sing it. Immigrants carried English language traditions to new countries. Schools, nursery books, recordings, television programs, and children's entertainment helped preserve the rhyme. By the time McCulloch bought the bridge, the words London Bridge already possessed a familiarity that no advertising agency could have created from scratch. This makes the bridge purchase an unusual example of a businessman recognizing cultural value in something a city regarded primarily as outdated infrastructure. London saw a bridge that needed replacing. McCulloch saw the same structure and recognized a name, a story, and an emotional association. Neither side was necessarily wrong. Objects can possess different kinds of value depending upon where they are and what someone intends to do with them. In central London, the old bridge occupied valuable space at an essential crossing and could not handle the future indefinitely. In Lake Havasu City, historic granite from London was unlike anything else available. The exact quality that made the bridge obsolete in one location, its age, made it valuable in another. McCulloch transformed a liability into an attraction by changing the context around it. The idea resembles the way old industrial buildings can become desirable apartments, factories can become museums, railway stations can become markets, and warehouses can become cultural spaces. Their original purpose fades, but the physical character accumulated through years of use becomes valuable in a new way. London Bridge underwent this transformation on a far larger geographic scale. Its old purpose was not entirely abandoned because it remained a bridge, but its cultural function became at least as important as its transportation function. McCulloch also benefited from timing. The late 1960s were a period of enormous interest in travel, development, and the expanding American West. Television could carry images of the project into homes across the country. Newspapers could reproduce photographs of numbered stones and cranes. Air travel made distant destinations increasingly accessible. A publicity event in London could therefore influence the reputation of a development in Arizona with a speed impossible in earlier centuries. The bridge itself became a continuing advertisement that required no scheduled campaign. Every traveler who photographed it, every article that explained its origin, and every person who returned home and told the story extended the original promotion. The investment kept producing recognition because the underlying fact never stopped being unusual. London Bridge remained in Arizona whether or not McCulloch was actively advertising it. Robert McCulloch did not live to see every stage of the city's later growth. He died in the year 1977, only a few years after the bridge was dedicated. By then, however, the project had already achieved its central purpose. Lake Havasu City had become known far beyond the region, and the bridge was permanently embedded in its identity. The developer who had purchased an obsolete crossing from London had created a landmark likely to outlast the marketing campaign that inspired it. C.V. Wood's role also illustrates how much the project depended upon people experienced in creating destinations rather than merely constructing buildings. Wood had been involved in the early development of Disneyland and later worked on other large projects. The planning of Lake Havasu City required thinking about how people experienced a place, how they arrived, what they remembered, and what would persuade them to return or settle there. London Bridge fit naturally into that way of thinking because it provided both a physical attraction and a story. The city's eventual incorporation in the year 1978 marked another stage in its transition from development project to established community. What began as McCulloch's ambitious plan had become a functioning municipality with residents, government, businesses, schools, neighborhoods, and an identity increasingly independent of its founder. London Bridge remained central to the city's image, but Lake Havasu City no longer existed merely as a real estate venture surrounding a famous imported landmark. As decades passed, the population continued to grow, and the bridge witnessed changes in Arizona just as it had witnessed changes in London. Roads became busier, waterfront development evolved, businesses opened and closed, and recreational patterns shifted. Boats became faster and more numerous. Visitors arrived with cameras that changed from film to digital, and eventually to phones capable of sending photographs around the world instantly. The bridge remained recognizable, while the technology used to photograph it transformed repeatedly. The survival of the bridge through these changes requires ordinary maintenance that rarely appears in romantic accounts of its relocation. Historic structures do not preserve themselves. Road surfaces wear, joints require inspection, concrete ages, stone needs monitoring, lighting systems change, and the effects of weather accumulate. The Arizona climate may be drier than London's, but heat creates its own engineering stresses as materials expand and contract. Continued use depends upon maintenance, just as every earlier London bridge depended upon generations willing to care for it. This ongoing maintenance connects the Arizona Bridge with the oldest theme in the nursery rhyme more closely than any uncertain Viking legend might. Bridges are never truly finished. Construction ends, but stewardship begins. Materials age from the moment they are exposed to weather and traffic. Every generation decides whether a structure is worth repairing, altering, replacing, or preserving. London Bridge has survived in so many forms because people repeatedly made those decisions. The medieval builders, who replaced timber with stone, were making one version of that choice. Rennie and the officials who commissioned his bridge made another. 20th century London decided replacement was necessary again, while McCulloch decided that the old material still had value. Arizona builders adapted it to modern engineering, and later generations continue maintaining the reconstructed bridge. The rhyme's repeated cycle of building and rebuilding turns out to be surprisingly appropriate, even if its precise historical inspiration remains unknown. The story also demonstrates that preservation does not always mean leaving something exactly where it is. Historians usually prefer important structures to remain in their original context because location carries information that cannot be moved. Yet sometimes a structure faces demolition regardless. In those circumstances, relocation can preserve material that would otherwise disappear. London Bridge lost its Thames setting, but gained decades of continued recognition in Arizona. The move also preserved public access. The granite did not disappear into a private estate where only a few people could see it. It became part of a functioning city, accessible to motorists, pedestrians, boaters, tourists, and residents. People can cross it without purchasing a museum ticket or arranging a special tour. In that sense, the bridge remains what it always was: public infrastructure encountered through ordinary movement. There is a certain continuity in imagining footsteps across the stone. The shoes are different, the clothing is different, the languages and accents around the bridge are different, and the water below is different, yet people still approach the arches because they need or want to reach the other side. A 19th century London commuter and a 21st century Arizona visitor would have almost nothing in common in their surroundings, but both could recognize the simple purpose of a bridge. The boats beneath it provide another continuity. On the Thames, rivercraft moved through Rennie's arches while the city crowded around them. At Lake Havasu, recreational boats pass through Bridgewater Channel, sometimes carrying visitors specifically interested in seeing the underside of the bridge. Looking upward from the water reveals the scale of the arches in a way that crossing above cannot. The stone appears heavy and old against the modern structure supporting it, making the combination of engineering periods easier to appreciate. At night, lighting changes the bridge again. Reflections stretch across the channel, and the desert heat gradually gives way to cooler evening air. The granite that once disappeared into London fog can now be illuminated beneath clear southwestern skies. Restaurants, paths, boats, and buildings around the channel create an atmosphere completely different from the commercial Thames of the Victorian period. Yet the arches continue providing the visual center of the scene. Seasonal events bring still other identities. Decorations, festivals, boating events, and British-themed celebrations can temporarily transform the waterfront. The bridge serves as a backdrop because it is immediately recognizable within the city. A structure built for transportation has become civic scenery, gathering place, historical exhibit, tourism symbol, and working road all at once. In that respect, the Arizona Bridge unexpectedly resembles Old London Bridge more than Rennie's 19th century version did. The medieval bridge was not merely infrastructure, it was a place where commerce, religion, residence, politics, spectacle, and transportation overlapped. The Arizona Bridge does not carry houses and shops on its roadway, but the surrounding waterfront similarly combines many activities around a crossing. People visit it for reasons that have little to do with simply getting from one bank to another. The ability of bridges to become places, rather than merely structures, helps explain why they attract such powerful stories. A road may pass unnoticed, but a bridge marks a transition. There is a clear before and after, one side and another, land giving way to water and returning again. People remember bridges because crossings create natural landmarks in both geography and imagination. London Bridge has carried that symbolic weight for an exceptionally long time. Medieval travellers saw it as the principal southern entrance to London. Merchants saw customers. Kings saw strategic importance. Engineers saw a problem of foundations, arches, traffic, and water. McCulloch saw publicity. Lake Havasu residents see part of their city's identity. Children who have never visited either London or Arizona may still hear the name and remember a song. Few structures manage to exist simultaneously in so many different forms of memory. There is the bridge of Roman archaeology, the bridge of Viking legend, the crowded medieval bridge of houses and shops, Rennie's granite bridge, the modern Thames crossing, the Arizona reconstruction, and the imaginary bridge of the nursery rhyme. They overlap in language, even though they belong to different centuries and materials. That overlap is why asking what happened to London Bridge produces such a surprisingly long answer. If the question refers to Old London Bridge, it was dismantled in the 19th century after more than 600 years. If it refers to Rennie's Bridge, its historic granite exterior went to Arizona. If it refers to London Bridge today, a modern structure still crosses the Thames. If it refers to the bridge in the rhyme, the answer disappears into folklore and uncertain history. The Arizona story sits at the center of these meanings because it is the chapter most likely to sound invented. Cities replace bridges all the time, but they rarely sell the old one to a businessman who ships its stones across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal to California, and then by truck into the desert. Planned communities seek publicity all the time, but few acquire an internationally known piece of infrastructure as their signature landmark. Bridges are reconstructed in new locations, but few make journeys measured in thousands of miles. The details become even stranger when remembered together. The bridge was purchased for more than $2 million. Thousands of granite blocks were numbered. The stones traveled by sea. The new structure was built largely on dry land. A channel was then excavated beneath it. The excavation created an island. An English-themed village appeared nearby. A former London bridge reopened beneath Arizona sunshine, and a city founded only a few years earlier suddenly possessed a landmark whose history reached back into the 19th century and whose name reached much farther still. Yet nothing supernatural was required. The entire story happened through contracts, engineering drawings, cranes, cargo ships, trucks, concrete, excavation equipment, stoneworkers, developers, and thousands of individual decisions. That practical foundation makes the result more remarkable rather than less. London Bridge did not arrive in Arizona through legend. People actually worked out how to do it. The bridge remains proof that an idea can sound ridiculous and still be technically possible. McCulloch's genius was not inventing a technology nobody had seen before. Every necessary tool already existed. His unusual contribution was seeing that those tools could be combined toward a goal almost nobody else had reason to imagine. Once the decision was made, an army of ordinary skills turned the improbable into infrastructure. That is perhaps why the story has lasted so well. It begins with something familiar enough to belong to childhood, moves backward through centuries of London history, and then suddenly becomes a tale of modern transportation and desert development. The bridge changes materials, surroundings, and purposes, while its name continues uninterrupted, linking worlds that otherwise seem to have very little in common. From a wooden crossing over the Thames to medieval stone, from Rennie's granite arches to numbered blocks aboard a ship, and finally to a reconstructed landmark over an Arizona channel, London Bridge has repeatedly demonstrated that even something built to connect two fixed points can have a remarkably unexpected journey of its own. The story of London Bridge is ultimately much larger than the remarkable journey of a collection of granite stones from England to Arizona. For nearly 2,000 years, people have needed to cross the Thames at London, and generation after generation found its own way to do it. Roman timber crossings disappeared and were replaced. Medieval wooden bridges came and went. Peter of Colechurch's great stone bridge endured for more than 6 centuries before John Rennie's 19th century bridge took its place. When that bridge could no longer meet the needs of modern London, the story might easily have ended with demolition, and a few surviving stones scattered as reminders of what had once stood there. Instead, Robert McCulloch saw another possibility, and London Bridge began a second life thousands of miles from the river for which it had been built. Today, the name London Bridge belongs to more than one place and more than one memory. A modern bridge continues to carry people across the Thames, preserving a crossing whose history reaches back toward Roman London. In Arizona, the granite exterior of Rennie's Bridge stands above the blue water of Bridgewater Channel, surrounded by palms, desert mountains, boats, homes, and a city that barely existed when the bridge was first offered for sale. The two bridges are separated by an ocean and a continent, yet both belong to the same long story of a crossing that has repeatedly changed without ever quite disappearing. And then there is the London Bridge, many of us encountered first, long before we knew anything about Roman engineers, medieval merchants, John Rennie, Robert McCulloch, or Lake Havasu City. It was the bridge in a childhood song, falling down and being built again, generation after generation. We may never know exactly which events first inspired those familiar words, and perhaps no single event ever did. What we do know is that the real history of London Bridge has followed a surprisingly similar rhythm. Bridges were built, repaired, replaced, and sometimes removed, while the crossing and its famous name continued onward. Perhaps that is what makes the journey to Arizona such a fitting chapter, rather than simply a strange ending. Rennie's Bridge had finished the job it was built to perform in London, but its story was not finished. Thousands of numbered granite blocks crossed the ocean, passed through the Panama Canal, traveled across the desert, and became part of a bridge once again. More than half a century later, people still drive across it, walk beside it, and pass beneath its arches by boat. The bridge that left London did not disappear. It simply found another stretch of water to cross. I hope you enjoyed learning how London Bridge ended up in Arizona and the remarkable history that traveled with it. Sleep tight.